My son's fiancée wanted to humiliate me until her own mother saw my face and started to cry. After being publicly humiliated by his son's fiancée and silently betrayed by his own son, the old father did not get angry. He just kept quiet. A few days later, the son came to him, begging for forgiveness. Dad, we are a family. Families forgive each other. Can we forget this and start over? The father looked straight into his son's eyes, his voice coldly calm. You can have your wedding. You can have your life with her, but you can't have both. He paused, letting each word sink in. If you choose her, you will no longer have me in your life. Over 99% of viewers just sat through this story without clicking like or subscribe. Actually, it's easy, just one tap. What time is it in your area, and where are you listening? The elevator opened directly into the apartment, and for a moment, Frank felt like he'd ascended into the clouds. The air inside was different, cool and still, smelling faintly of citrus and, what was it, ozone? It was the smell of money, he supposed. Everything was white. The walls, the sofa that looked like a marshmallow someone had sat on, the sleek, sterile kitchen. It was less a home and more a gallery, a place where people came to admire things they were afraid to touch. Dad, you made it. Liam's hug was genuine. A familiar squeeze that reminded Frank of the boy who used to cling to his leg, smelling of dirt and scraped knees. But the man holding him now was different, dressed in a soft, gray sweater that probably cost more than Frank's first car. Then Ashley was there, gliding across the polished concrete floor. Her hug was the opposite of Liam's brittle, airy embrace that felt more like a suggestion than a welcome. Frank, so good to see you. Her smile was dazzling, a perfect arrangement of white teeth. Oh, what's this? Frank held out the oak toolbox. He'd spent the last month on it, stripping back layers of grime and neglect, sanding the wood until its deep, honeyed grain emerged. He'd polished the brass latches until they gleamed and lined the inside with soft green felt. The scent of linseed oil and old wood, a smell Frank equated with honesty and hard work, clung to it. Just a little something for the new place, he said. Every home needs a proper toolbox. Ashley took it, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Oh, how rustic, Frank. She ran a perfectly manicured finger over the lid. It's very authentic. Her laugh was a little too clear, like the tapping of glass. The sound of something beautiful that could shatter at any moment. She turned to Liam. Honey, find a special place for this, won't you? Later, dinner was served on the rooftop terrace. The view was breathtaking. A panorama of the Golden Gate Bridge draped in a soft veil of fog as the lights of San Francisco began to twinkle across the bay. Frank felt like an imposter among the young, sharp-edged guests who spoke a language he didn't quite understand, a dialect of fundraising rounds, IPOs, and wintering in Tulum. He nursed a beer, the cold bottle of familiar comfort in his hand, and listened. He was searching for the bathroom when he passed the laundry room, a space as immaculate as the rest of the apartment. Tucked in the corner, behind a sleek, self-driving mop and a row of identical white bottles, was the oak toolbox. It looked small and out of place, a piece of the past shoved into a future that had no room for it. He felt a pang, not of anger, but of a quiet, distant sadness. He was looking at his son from the other side of a thick pane of glass, and he didn't know how to break through. Back on the terrace, a young man with a ridiculously expensive watch was holding court. My father-in-law has opened every door for me, he boasted, beaming at a woman who was presumably his fiancée. I'm not ashamed to say it. Family is everything. Ashley let out a tinkling laugh. She placed her hand over Liam's, a gesture that was both affectionate and possessive. Her voice, though not loud, carried across the table with perfect clarity. You're different, honey, she said, looking directly at Liam but speaking for the benefit of her audience. You're a self-made man. You don't owe anyone anything. The words were an invisible blade, severing a cord Frank hadn't even realized was still connecting them. All the years of overtime, the missed holidays, the savings scraped together to give Liam the education he'd never had, all of it erased in a single, careless sentence. Liam's eyes flickered toward Frank for a brief moment. A hint of something guilt? Apology? before he looked back at Ashley and smiled. As the evening wound down, Ashley approached Frank, her hostess smile firmly in place. My parents are having their annual Halloween party at their place in Napa, she announced. It was a major social event, Frank gathered. The kind of thing that got written up in society columns. You have to come, Frank. It's a costume party. She paused, her eyes scanning his simple flannel shirt and jeans with a look that was almost pity. Try to fit in. It was both an invitation and a dismissal. A final, patronizing pat on the head. Ashley saw him not as Liam's father, but as a social liability. A widower from a working-class background who could be trotted out to make her look like a compassionate, down-to-earth daughter-in-law. The Halloween party loomed in Frank's mind. No longer a celebration, but a test. The question hung in the cool Sausalito air, a silent challenge. Would he wear the costume they wanted him to wear? Or would he show them who he really was? The days leading up to the party were quiet. Too quiet. Frank found himself standing in front of his open closet one afternoon, staring at the neat, uninspired rows of clothing. Flannel shirts in varying shades of blue and green, sensible khaki pants, a handful of sweaters his late wife, Mary, had bought him for Christmases past. It was the wardrobe of a man whose life had shrunk, its edges worn smooth by routine and the loneliness that had become a constant, low hum in the background of his days. What costume could possibly come from this? A lumberjack? A retired man? He was already playing that part. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, and Liam's name flashed on the screen. Frank knew, somehow, what the call was about. Dad? Hey, just checking in. Liam's voice was strained, overly cheerful. So, about this party. Ashley and I are at this amazing costume store downtown. It's called Fantasia. They have everything. Pirates, astronauts, those guys from that show, with the dragons. There was a pause. Frank could hear Ashley's soft, insistent murmur in the background. Listen, Liam continued, his voice dropping slightly. Ashley said she'd love to pay for your costume as a gift, so you don't have to worry about it. A gift. The offer hung in the air, a sugar-coated insult. It wasn't about generosity, it was about control. It implied he was a charity case, a problem to be managed and packaged neatly so he wouldn't clash with the decor at their perfect party. His taste was inadequate, his means insufficient. I don't need that, Liam, Frank said, his voice calm and steady, revealing none of the sudden weariness that settled over him. I have my own ideas. A long, crackling silence stretched between them. Frank could picture his son perfectly, running a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed with the familiar anxiety that Ashley seemed to cultivate in him. Oh, Liam finally said. Okay, well, just make it good. Okay, Dad? After he hung up, Frank sat on the edge of his bed in the gathering dusk, the phone heavy in his hand. Make it good. The phrase echoed in the silent house. Outside, the neighborhood kids were shrieking with laughter, their excitement for the coming Halloween, a sharp counterpoint to the quiet in his own home. And then, a memory, unbidden and sharp, rose from the depths. I can smell it, burning plastic and roasting pumpkin. The scent is sickly sweet, a Halloween nightmare come to life. Screams are muffled by the wail of sirens, a chaotic symphony under a sky choked with thick black smoke. A child's plastic pirate sword has melted onto the asphalt, a grotesque puddle of orange. It was a house party. So many costumes, so many bright, happy faces that were now smeared with ash and terror. He's running, his gear weighing him down, but his heart is heavier, a cold heartstone in his chest, because he knows he's too late for some of them. The memory receded, leaving Frank in the dark, his breathing shallow. The fire had been 20 years ago, on a Halloween night just like this one. A night that had changed everything. He hadn't thought about it in years, not really. But Ashley's casual command, try to fit in, had dislodged something deep inside him. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He went not to his closet, but to the pull-down ladder that led to the attic. The air upstairs was thick with the scent of dust and time. In the far corner, under a canvas tarp, was an old steamer trunk. He lifted the heavy lid. There, folded with a care that bordered on reverence, was his dress uniform. The navy blue wool was worn, the gold buttons slightly tarnished. He lifted the jacket, its weight familiar in his hands. It still carried a faint, indelible scent of smoke, a ghost of 100 fires. This was not a costume. This was not a game. It was a testimony. He wasn't wearing it to mock a tragedy or to play a part. He was wearing it with a solemnity that felt like a prayer. It was his history, his honor, his grief. It was who he was. Frank moved from feeling like a guest in his own life, overlooked and passive, to a man with a purpose. He wasn't doing this to spite Ashley or to challenge her world. He was doing this for himself. He carried the uniform downstairs. The stage was set. Frank was on his way to the party, a ghost from a past they had tried so hard to forget. The inevitable confrontation awaited, and for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for it. The Vance family estate in Napa Valley wasn't a house. It was a declaration. A long, winding driveway, flanked by ancient oak trees, led to a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion that seemed to rise organically from the rolling, vine-covered hills. Frank parked his modest sedan between a gleaming black Tesla and a vintage Porsche, feeling as though he'd taken a wrong turn into a movie set. He'd barely stepped onto the flagstone path when the calculated fantasy of the evening enveloped him. The theme was a mysterious Gothic garden. Lanterns with flickering faux candles hung from the gnarled branches of olive trees, casting long, dancing shadows. Artificial fog machines pumped clouds of low-lying mist that swirled around his ankles, smelling faintly of glycerin. A live jazz band played a mournful, sophisticated tune from a gazebo draped in black velvet. The guests were a curated collection of Silicon Valley royalty. Tech CEOs dressed as mad scientists, venture capitalists in ironic vampire capes, and sinewy heiresses disguised as tragic Gothic heroines. Their costumes were clever, expensive, and designed to signal that they were in on a joke Frank didn't understand. Amidst the sea of sequins, silk, and inside references, his simple, unadorned uniform felt less like a costume and more like a confession. It was real. It was heavy with a history that felt alien in this place of effortless wealth. He spotted Liam and Ashley near a bubbling fountain that had been dyed a theatrical blood red. Liam looked pale and tense in a surprisingly well-fitted pirate costume, while Ashley was a vision as a snow queen, her gown glittering with thousands of tiny crystals, a silver crown perched on her perfectly styled hair. As Frank approached, he saw a flicker of something in Liam's eyes, not pleasure, but a kind of pained resignation. Before they could exchange more than a strained greeting, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and a sharp suit, clearly his costume was successful businessman, approached their group, a woman in a sleek Morticia Adams gown on his arm. "Liam, Ashley, marvelous party," the man boomed. His eyes landed on Frank, a flicker of genuine interest lighting his face. He extended a hand. "Arthur Davenport." "And you are?" "Frank," he said, shaking the man's firm, dry hand. "Great costume, Frank. Very authentic," Mr. Davenport said with an appreciative nod. "The attention to detail is remarkable. Must have cost a pretty penny." Before Frank could answer, Ashley glided forward, linking her arm through Mr. Davenport's. Her voice was as sweet as honey, but her words were shards of broken glass. "Oh, Mr. Davenport, you're too kind. Frank is just good at recycling." She smiled, a radiant, transactional expression that didn't reach her eyes. She turned her head just enough to include a small circle of onlookers who had gravitated toward the prominent investor. Her voice rose, clear and cutting, a performer hitting her big line. "Don't you all think it's just darling? A poor old man getting to play the hero for a night? This is probably the most exciting thing he's done in 20 years. There were really 4 plays from Lee." A profound, deafening silence fell over the group. The jazz music from the gazebo suddenly sounded harsh and intrusive. The artificial fog seemed to thicken, isolating them in the bubble of acute social horror. Everyone suddenly found their drinks, their shoes, the Gothic gargoyles on the fountain. Utterly fascinating. Mr. Davenport's smile froze and then vanished. His wife, the woman in the Morticia gown, gave Ashley a look of such cold, undisguised contempt that Frank almost felt a pang of pity for her. The humiliation was public, precise, and expertly delivered. But Frank wasn't looking at Ashley. He wasn't looking at the horrified guests. He looked at his son. He searched Liam's face for a spark of defiance, a word of defense, anything to show that the man he raised was still in there somewhere. Liam's eyes were fixed on the stone ground, his face a mask of misery. He wouldn't look at his father. He mumbled something, his voice a pathetic whisper in the face of his fiancée's gale-force cruelty. Ashley, don't. That was it. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't an admonishment. It was the weak plea of a man trying to perform social damage control, to quiet a disturbance, not to stand up for his father. It was the sound of complete and utter surrender. And in that moment, something inside Frank's heart, a warm and vital thing that had burned steadily for over 30 years, went cold. The unconditional love he held for his son didn't vanish, but it was encasing ice. He was looking at a stranger. The betrayal was so absolute, so much deeper than Ashley's petty cruelty, that it left him breathless. Frank didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He gave Liam one last, long look. Then he turned his back straight and walked away from the circle of frozen guests. He moved past the blood-red fountain and the jazz band, heading toward the darker, unlit edges of the sprawling garden, his heart a hollow, aching void. The party was still in full swing, but for him, it was over. He had never felt so utterly alone. Frank walked until the sound of the jazz band was a faint, melancholy whisper and the artificial fog had thinned into nothingness. He found himself in a forgotten corner of the vast estate, a formal rose garden that had clearly been left out of the party's gothic theatrics. Here, the air was cool and clean, smelling of damp earth and the faint, spicy scent of late-blooming roses. A marble bench, cold and unforgiving, sat beside a tiered fountain that was dark and silent, its basins filled with dry leaves instead of water. He sat down. The cold of the stone seeped through his trousers, a welcome, grounding sensation. He wasn't waiting for an apology. He wasn't even waiting for Liam to come find him. He was simply waiting for the roaring in his ears to subside, for the tremor in his hands to still. He needed a moment to gather the scattered pieces of himself before undertaking the long, quiet drive home. The pain didn't come as a hot, rushing wave of anger. It was something colder, quieter. My heart doesn't hurt anymore, he thought. It just feels empty. A room where the fire has just gone out, leaving only the smell of ashes. He looked down at the dark wool of his uniform jacket, at the brass buttons that gleamed dully in the moonlight. He had polished them this afternoon, just as he had polished them 1,000 times before. It was a ritual of respect, for the uniform, for the men he had served with, for the life he had lived. A life of substance, he'd always believed. A life built on the simple, solid principles of honor, duty, and sacrifice. He had sacrificed. He had worked the double shifts, the holidays, the grueling overtime, pouring every spare dollar into a future for his son that would be brighter and easier than his own. He'd done it without a second thought, believing it was the foundation upon which Liam would build his own honorable life. He saw now how wrong he'd been. To Ashley, and by extension to Liam, that foundation wasn't something to be built upon, but something to be bulldozed, hidden beneath a layer of polished concrete and imported marble. His sacrifice wasn't a gift. It was an embarrassment, a rustic, working-class stain on their perfect, minimalist world. From his vantage point in the shadows, he could see a brightly lit portion of the lawn across the garden. And he could see them. Ashley stood with her back to him, but her posture was unmistakable, imperious, and self-satisfied. She was stroking Liam's arm, a soothing, proprietary gesture, the way one might calm a skittish horse. Liam was nodding, his shoulders slumped in his ridiculous pirate costume. He looked like a child being gently scolded and reassured after a minor transgression. They were talking about him. Frank knew it with absolute certainty. It was a scene from a courtroom where he had already been tried and convicted in absentia. The verdict: guilty of being old, of being poor, of not fitting in. He felt a profound sense of detachment as he watched them. The anger had cooled to a hard, dense clarity. He had been so focused on the insult, on the public humiliation, that he had missed the real truth. I didn't lose my son tonight, he thought, the words forming with the cold finality of an epitaph. I lost him a long time ago. Tonight is just the day I got the death certificate. Liam hadn't been caught between two worlds. He had chosen one decisively and completely, and Frank was not in it. He took a deep breath, the night air chilling his lungs. It was time to go. He would leave without a word, a quiet ghost slipping out of a party where he never belonged. He had just pushed himself to his feet when the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path made him freeze. A woman emerged from the shadows. She was tall and elegant, dressed as a 1922 flapper, her dark hair in a sharp bob, a long string of pearls looped around her neck. She moved with a hesitant grace, her eyes scanning the darkness. She didn't look like she was enjoying the party. She looked worried, her brow furrowed, her painted red lips pressed into a thin, anxious line. As she drew closer, Frank recognized the strong facial structure, the same deep-set eyes. It was Ashley's mother, Eleanor Vance. She stopped a few feet away, clutching a small, beaded purse in her hands. She seemed to be wrestling with what to say. "Mr. Franklin?" she said, her voice softer and far less certain than her daughter's. Frank stood still, a sentinel in the dark garden. The emotional storm had passed, leaving the terrifying calm in its wake. He was no longer a victim processing a wound. He was a survivor assessing the damage. Eleanor's unexpected appearance was a variable he hadn't accounted for. He watched her, his face unreadable, his heart a cold, quiet chamber. He was alert, he was tired. He simply waited to see what would happen next. Would she apologize for her daughter? Or had she come to deliver the final, killing blow? Her presence was a question mark, hanging in the silent, ash-filled air. "Mr. Franklin?" Eleanor Vance repeated, her voice a fragile thing in the vast quiet of the garden. I wanted to apologize for my daughter's behavior. It was inexcusable." "Had I sinned?" Frank simply nodded. An apology felt like a flimsy bandage on a mortal wound. It didn't matter. "No need," he said, his own voice sounding distant, rusty. "But there is," she insisted, taking another hesitant step forward. She was close enough now that he could smell her perfume, a heavy floral scent that seemed out of place in the earthy darkness. "Ashley, she can be very competitive. She sees everything as a reflection on her." Frank remained silent. He had no interest in dissecting Ashley's psychology. He just wanted to leave. But Eleanor didn't move away. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her gaze dropping from his face to the uniform jacket. A strange, puzzled expression flickered across her features. Her eyes, so much like her daughter's but carrying a different, heavier weight, were scanning his uniform like a document she was struggling to read. "Forgive me," she began, her tone shifting from polite apology to something more urgent, more focused. "This is a strange question, but your uniform is very detailed." "It's the real thing," Frank said flatly. Her eyes narrowed, zeroing in on a small, circular patch on his sleeve, faded with age. "Engine Company 4? That's right." A flicker of curiosity, the first real emotion he'd felt since the confrontation, pierced through the numb shell around his heart. How would she know that? Eleanor's polite, socialite mask was beginning to crumble. She stepped even closer, violating the comfortable distance between strangers. Her eyes darted from the patch on his sleeve up to the helmet he held cradled in his arm. "And the helmet," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The serial number stenciled on the back. Is it 12? Frank turned the helmet slightly. In the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, the white painted number was just visible. "Station 12. That's where I was captain." "Station 12, she repeated, the words sounding less like a confirmation and more like an incantation. Her breathing was becoming shallow, audible. Her manicured hands, holding the small beaded purse, were trembling. She reached out a hesitant finger, not quite touching the helmet, but pointing toward a deep, jagged scratch that marred the protective visor. "And the scratch on the glass. I think I remember." She let the sentence hang, unfinished, a ghost in the air between them. Her gaze then fell to his hand. to the pale, puckered line of an old scar that peeked out from the cuff of his jacket. She took a sharp, involuntary breath. Her eyes were wide now, locked on the mark. Just then, the sound of other footsteps on the gravel path broke the strange spell. Ashley and Liam appeared, their forms silhouetted against the distant party lights. Ashley's voice was sharp, a tool of immediate and total control. "Mom, what are you doing all the way out here? You're bothering Mr. Franklin. Liam's dad probably wants to be alone." She spoke about him as if he weren't there, a piece of furniture to be navigated around. Liam hovered behind her, his face a miserable portrait of discomfort. He looked from his fiancée to his father to his future mother-in-law, a man caught in a crossfire of his own making. Ashley moved to take Eleanor's arm, but her mother flinched away, her attention still fixed, with a terrifying intensity, on Frank. "Mom, honestly, don't make this so weird," Ashley hissed, her embarrassment curdling into annoyance. She shot a look at Frank, a look that said, "See what I have to deal with? It's just a costume." The words were meant to dismiss, to normalize, to end the bizarre scene. But they had the opposite effect. They were the final key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 2 decades. Eleanor ignored her daughter completely, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified recognition, lifted from the scar on his wrist to finally meet Frank's gaze. The pieces assembled themselves in a violent, shattering crash. The house party, the smoke, the screams, the smell of burning plastic and pumpkin. The firefighter who had emerged from the blackness, carrying a small, limp body, the scratch on his helmet visor illuminated for a split second by the flashing red lights. The number 12. Ashley sighed theatrically. "Mom, let's go. It's just a costume." Eleanor turned, her movement so sudden and violent that Ashley recoiled. Tears were streaming down her face, carving clean tracks through her expensive makeup. Her voice, when it came, was not a whisper. It was a raw, ragged scream that tore through the manicured quiet of the Napa Valley night, a sound filled with 20 years of buried terror and a gratitude so profound it bordered on agony. "It's not a costume." Eleanor's scream, "It's not a costume," was a rock thrown into the placid, carefully curated pond of the party. The ripples of shock spread instantly. The gentle jazz music, which had been the sophisticated heartbeat of the evening, seemed to falter and then die completely. Conversation ceased, heads turned. The soft, flattering party lights now felt like harsh, interrogating spotlights, and the corner of the rose garden was no longer a private alcove, but the center stage of a horrifyingly public drama. Drawn by the raw, primal sound of the scream, the nearby guests, including the formidable Mr. Davenport and his wife, began to drift closer. Their curiosity piqued. Their ironic costumes and detached amusement were gone, replaced by the focused, unblinking gaze of a crowd sensing blood in the water. Ashley's face was a mask of pure, white-hot panic. Her first instinct, as always, was control. She lunged for her mother's arm, her voice a frantic, commanding hiss. "Mom, what nonsense are you talking about? You've had too much champagne. Let me take you inside, right now." But Eleanor tore her arm away with a strength Ashley had never seen before. The poised, elegant hostess was gone, replaced by a woman stripped bare by a 20-year-old memory. Tears streamed down her face, but her eyes were blazing with a terrifying clarity. She pointed a trembling finger at Frank, her voice ringing out across the suddenly silent garden. "No, don't you understand?" she cried, her words directed at Ashley, but meant for everyone. "The house, our old house on Oak Street. Halloween night, there was a fire. Hazinar." As she spoke, the scene began to fracture, splitting into multiple perspectives. For the guests, it was a shocking piece of theater. For Ashley and Liam, it was a social nightmare. But for Eleanor and Frank, the manicured Napa garden dissolved, replaced by a vision of hell. Eleanor's memory, smoke, thick and black and choking. The smell of it acrid and suffocating. And the heat, an incredible, pressing heat. I'm on the floor of my bedroom. The door is blocked. I can hear sirens, but they sound a million miles away. The window shatters. A shape is there, a dark figure against a backdrop of orange flame. A man in a helmet. He's yelling something. I can't move. He lifts me, his arms like steel bands. A piece of the ceiling, a burning beam, falls right where I was lying. He shields me with his body as he carries me toward the window, toward the air. Frank's memory, Oak Street, a 2-story colonial, flames gutting the second floor. A report of a young woman trapped in the master bedroom. He remembers the heat on his face as he went up the ladder, the roar of the fire like a hungry animal. He remembers kicking the door, finding her on the floor, barely conscious. He remembers the groan of the house as it began to surrender to the flames. He remembers the beam falling, the sharp, searing pain as a shower of hot glass and embers rained down on his arm, the jagged tear in his jacket. He remembers pushing her out the window to the ladder and the crew below, and the helmet getting scraped against the collapsing window frame. Eleanor's voice brought them all back to the present. She stumbled forward, her finger pointing directly at the old pale scar on Frank's wrist, visible where his jacket cuff was slightly frayed. The burn, she choked out. The falling glass. I remember. He covered me. Then her wild eyes darted to the helmet in Frank's arm. That scratch. That's when the beam fell, right after he pulled me away. Liam stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. What's going on? He stammered, looking from the sobbing, hysterical woman he was supposed to call his mother-in-law to the silent, stunned man who was his father. The world had tilted on its axis, and he couldn't find his footing. But Ashley's shock was rapidly being consumed by a different kind of horror, social annihilation. She glanced frantically at Mr. Davenport, whose face was now a mask of cold, dawning comprehension. She looked at the other guests, their eyes wide with judgment. This wasn't about her mother's past. This was about her future. This is ridiculous, she stammered, her voice shaking with a rage born of pure humiliation. Mom, you are embarrassing me. The words, so profoundly selfish, so utterly devoid of empathy, landed with the force of a physical blow. The last vestiges of sympathy for her in the crowd evaporated. Mr. Davenport took a slow, deliberate step forward. He looked from Eleanor's tear-streaked face to Frank's stoic silence, and then he fixed his gaze upon Ashley. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it carried an arctic chill that cut through the night. Little girl, he said, the honorific dripping with contempt. He repeated her own words back to her, and they were no longer an insult, but a damning indictment. You call this a poor old man playing the hero? Ashley flinched, as if he had struck her. Her carefully constructed reality, the world in which she was the arbiter of taste and status, collapsed into dust. She was no longer the judge. She was the defendant, and the verdict was guilty. She looked at Frank, at this simple, working-class man she had dismissed and despised, and for the first time, she saw him. She saw the scar, the scratch, the quiet dignity, and understood that he was more real than anything in her life. She backed away, her face ashen. No, she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. No, it can't be. Frank didn't gloat. There was no victory in this. As he watched Eleanor sob, he wasn't a hero. He was just a man remembering the screams, the terror, the young woman whose life had almost ended. The truth didn't bring him joy, only a profound, echoing sadness for the ghosts people carry. That's how they dealt with them, he thought. They built beautiful, impenetrable walls around them. But tonight, a ghost hadn't just knocked on the door. It had kicked it down and set the whole house on fire. He looked at Ashley, and for a fleeting second, he didn't see the cruel, calculating woman who had humiliated him. He saw a frightened child, panicking as her world burned down around her. The flicker of pity was there, but it was quickly extinguished by a cold, hard truth. The party was over. The perfect facade was shattered, leaving only the ugly, smoking ruins. Liam stood paralyzed between the father he had betrayed and the fiancée he had just seen for who she truly was. Ashley was a pariah in her own home, exposed in front of the very people she sought to impress. And Frank and Eleanor stood in the center of it all, two survivors bound by a fiery memory, facing each other properly for the first time in 20 years, with a world of unspoken history hanging in the silent, ash-filled air between them. Over 99% of viewers just sat through this story without clicking like or subscribe. Actually, it's easy, just one tap. What time is it in your area, and where are you listening? The party did not so much end as it collapsed. Within minutes of Eleanor's cry, the gothic fantasy evaporated, leaving behind a scene of raw, unbearable social awkwardness. Guests, including a visibly disgusted Mr. Davenport, offered clipped, formal goodbyes to a man who appeared to be Ashley's father, a quiet, distinguished man named Robert Vance, and fled as if escaping a contagion. The jazz band packed up in record time. The artificial fog dissipated, revealing trampled grass and abandoned champagne flutes. Frank had intended to slip away in the chaos, but Eleanor had grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Please," she had whispered, her face pale and ravaged. "Don't go. Not yet." G, Ray. It was Robert Vance who led them inside, away from the prying eyes of the catering staff. He was a man who radiated a quiet, wary competence, and he guided them through the grand, silent house into a library. It was a room designed to impress floor-to-ceiling oak shelves, leather-bound books that looked as if they'd never been read, a large unlit fireplace, and silver-framed family photographs that chronicled Ashley's perfect, smiling life. But tonight, the luxurious, noble space felt like a stuffy, airless courtroom. Robert gently guided his still trembling wife to a plush leather armchair before turning to Liam and Ashley, who had followed them in like defendants being led to the dock. "Sit," he said, his voice soft but unbreakable. Ashley sat on the edge of a sofa, her posture rigid. She wouldn't look at anyone, her gaze fixed on the Persian rug as if trying to decipher its intricate patterns. Liam sat beside her, but a chasm of several feet separated them. He looked at his father, his eyes filled with a dawning horror, and a shame so profound it seemed to physically diminish him. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. It was Ashley who finally broke it, her voice a reedy, theatrical whisper. "Frank, She wrung her hands. A perfect pantomime of contrition. It was another performance, this one titled The Repentant Girl. "I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. What I said, it was stupid and cruel and..." Frank watched her, his expression unreadable. His anger was gone, burned away, leaving behind a state of terrifying clarity. He interrupted her, not with rage, but with a calm, almost gentle question that was more piercing than any accusation. "You're sorry for what? Exactly, Ashley?" She looked up, startled. I'm sorry for everything." "No," Frank said, his voice still soft but firm as bedrock. "That's too easy. Let's be specific. Are you sorry for what you said? Or are you sorry that you said it in front of your mother and Mr. Davenport?" Ashley's mouth opened and closed. She had no answer. He had seen straight through the performance to the terrified, self-serving motive beneath. He wasn't attacking her. He was simply stating a truth as plain as the uniform he wore. "You don't regret thinking I was a poor old man," he continued, his tone one of quiet observation. "You just regret that your calculation was wrong. Honor, Ashley, isn't something you can turn on and off depending on who's listening." Each calm, measured word landed on her with the weight of a physical blow. Her facade of remorse shattered, and for the first time, a flicker of her true self-resentment flashed in her eyes. It was Eleanor who spoke into the ensuing silence, her voice hoarse with unshed tears. She was looking at Frank, but her words were a confession to the entire room. "I never told her," she said, her hands twisting a silk handkerchief in her lap. "I never told anyone the details. After the fire, I just wanted to forget, to start over." Frank nodded slowly, the fragmented memories of that night coalescing around her words. "I always wonder about that house," he said, his voice distant, as if speaking to himself. "The smoke was too thick, too fast. And the smoke alarm, I didn't hear one." Eleanor's head dropped. "Because my ex-husband Ashley's biological father took the batteries out. It kept going off by mistake," he said. She took a ragged breath. "We'd had a terrible argument. He was drunk. He fell asleep with a lit cigarette on the sofa." She looked up, her eyes pleading with Frank to understand. The fire was his fault. He got out. He just ran. He left me in there. The secret hung in the air. A toxic, 20-year-old plume of smoke. It explained everything. Eleanor's frantic need to build a new, perfect life. Her choice of a stable, reliable man like Robert and Ashley. It explained Ashley. That's why I never talked about it, Eleanor whispered. I had to rebuild everything for her. I wanted her to have a perfect life, to erase that ugly beginning. I wanted her to feel secure, powerful. Her voice broke, and she looked at her daughter, whose face was now a mask of stunned disbelief. But maybe in trying to protect her from the shame, I created a monster. As if on cue, Ashley shot up from the sofa. Her eyes were wild, darting between her mother and Frank. She felt cornered, exposed, but most of all, she felt betrayed. Her mother was siding with the enemy, dismantling the very foundation of the perfect life she had so painstakingly built for her. Without a word, she turned and fled the library, slamming the heavy oak door behind her. The sound echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. Liam didn't move. He sat there, a statue of disillusionment, the ruins of his ambitions and his love life scattered around him. He was finally seeing the rot at the core of the beautiful, shiny world he had tried so desperately to join. Frank finally rose to his feet. He looked at Eleanor, and for the first time, he saw not the matriarch of a wealthy family, but a fellow survivor. A deep, quiet bond had been forged between them in the ashes of the past. He understood the terrible burden she had carried, and she, in turn, was the first person in years to see the man inside his uniform. He turned to leave. He had said all that needed to be said. He didn't need an apology anymore. The truth was enough. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at Liam, who was still staring into the abyss. I don't need you to defend my honor, son, Frank said, his voice heavy with a sad, final finality. I just needed to know that you knew it was worth defending. He walked out, leaving Liam alone in the wreckage. The relationship between Ashley and Liam was broken. The Vance family was in crisis. The wedding, Frank knew, was an illusion that had just gone up in smoke. And the confrontation that mattered most, the one between a father and the son he no longer recognized, was already over. The week that followed the disastrous party was one of profound and heavy silence. Frank didn't call Liam, and Liam didn't call him. Frank returned to his routine, to the quiet comfort of his woodshop. The scent of cedar and sawdust was a balm, a tangible reality in a world that had suddenly felt flimsy and theatrical. He worked on restoring an old rocking chair, the rhythmic scrape of the sandpaper a meditative act. He didn't feel angry anymore. He just felt a deep, bone-weary sadness. He was applying a coat of linseed oil, the rich scent filling the small workshop, when a car he didn't recognize, a sleek, dark blue Audi, pulled into his driveway. Liam got out. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, the shadows under his eyes telling a story of sleepless nights. He was holding a large, ostentatious gift basket wrapped in cellophane, a ridiculous collection of Napa wines and artisanal cheeses that looked completely alien in the rustic simplicity of Frank's yard. Liam entered the workshop, the temple of Frank's authentic world, and immediately seemed to shrink. He looked around at the tools hanging neatly on the pegboard walls, at the stacks of fragrant lumber, at the half-finished chair, and the chasm between their lives yawned open. He placed the basket on a workbench, a hollow thud that echoed in the quiet space. It was an empty gesture, an attempt to buy forgiveness with expensive trinkets. "Dad," he began, his voice raspy. He couldn't meet Frank's eyes. Frank didn't say anything. He just continued to methodically rub the oil into the wood, his movements slow and deliberate. I came to apologize," Liam stammered, the words sounding rehearsed and hollow. "For that night. For everything." Frank stopped his work and finally looked at his son. "An apology for Ashley, or an apology from you?" Liam flinched. "From me," he said, his voice cracking. He finally looked up, and Frank saw the genuine anguish in his eyes. "I stood there and I didn't say anything. I was so scared, Dad. Scared of losing her, scared of losing that whole world I thought I wanted. It was the first honest thing he had said. You chose her, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I chose her over you. Frank nodded slowly, a gesture of acknowledgement, not forgiveness. And where is she now? A new wave of misery washed over Liam's face. She's not doing well. Her parents are distant. Her mother barely speaks to her. Ashley's been calling everyone who was there that night, Mr. Davenport, all of them, trying to explain, she calls it, apologizing, saying she was stressed, that it was a misunderstanding. Frank felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. She's making it worse, he said. It wasn't a question. 100 times worse, Liam confirmed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. She sounds desperate, guilty. It's a train wreck. He took a deep, shaky breath, steeling himself for his final plea. But we're still getting married, Dad. And we're a family. Families forgive. I was hoping, for my sake, you could try to forget this, so we can all move on, start over. Frank put down his oil-soaked rag. He looked at his son, at this man he had raised, who still believed that a wound so deep could be papered over with a flimsy request. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked a question, his tone calm and lethally precise. And what do you think that costs, Liam? What? Liam asked, confused. Your honor, Frank clarified. My legacy. The memory of what I did and the truth of who she is. What's the price for forgetting all that? A basket of cheese? The quiet question was more devastating than any shouted accusation. It cornered Liam with the full weight of his own cowardice. He had no answer. Frank walked over to the wall of his workshop, where an old, framed photograph hung. It was of a younger Frank with his arm around Mary, both of them beaming, holding a tiny, bundled Liam. Everything I ever built, Frank said, his voice thick with emotion for the first time. Everything I ever saved, every lesson I ever tried to teach you, it was for you. It's your inheritance. Not just the money or this house, but the name, the honor that comes with it. And the friend, he turned back to face his son, his eyes clear and sad. He was about to deliver the final, most painful lesson of all. I love you, Liam. Nothing will ever change that. But I will not stand beside you at a wedding and watch you marry a woman who spit on the very foundation of this family. I will not welcome her into this house. And I will not allow my legacy, everything your mother and I worked for, to be passed into the hands of someone who holds it in such contempt. They either inclusion. He was handing the choice back to his son, but it was no longer a simple one. It was an ultimatum, delivered not with anger, but with the heavy finality of truth. You can have your wedding, Frank said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You can have your life with her, but you can't have both. If you choose her, you choose to walk away from all of this. From me? Liam stood in the middle of the workshop, the scent of wood and oil and honesty filling his lungs, and finally understood. The dominoes, set in motion by a single cruel comment at the party, were now falling, and they were about to crush his entire world. He was at a crossroads, and for the first time, there was no easy path, no way to please everyone. There was only a choice and a consequence. The drive from his father's house back to the city was a blur. Liam felt as though he were moving through a thick fog. The familiar landmarks of his life rendered strange and indistinct. Frank's ultimatum was not a weapon. It was a mirror, and in it, Liam had been forced to see a reflection of himself he could no longer ignore. He wasn't going to the penthouse to break up with Ashley. He was going there, with one last, desperate flicker of hope, to see if the woman he thought he loved was still in there somewhere. The apartment was silent when he let himself in. The minimalist space, once a symbol of their success and sophisticated taste, now felt like a sterile, airless museum. The panoramic view of San Francisco Bay, usually so breathtaking, seemed to mock the chaos and claustrophobia of their lives. Ashley was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of white wine in her hand, looking out at the city. She turned as he entered, her face a carefully composed mask of concern. Liam, darling, she said, her voice smooth as silk. You were gone so long. Did you handle it? The question, so transactional, so devoid of genuine worry, was the first crack in his fragile hope. I spoke to him. Yes, Liam said, his voice flat. He remained by the door, not wanting to be drawn further into the pristine white cage of their home. He told her everything. He recounted his father's words, not the ultimatum, but the core of it, the meaning of legacy, the weight of honor, the pain of her disrespect. He spoke quietly, hoping she would hear the profound sadness and moral injury, not just a strategic problem. He washed her face as he spoke, searching for a flicker of remorse, of understanding. He saw nothing. Her expression tightened, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't hearing a story of a father's hurt. She was hearing about a thread to their wedding, their status, their meticulously planned future. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. She took a delicate sip of her wine. So, she finally said, her voice dangerously calm, "He's making you choose." "He's asking me who I am," Liam corrected, a newfound clarity hardening his own voice. "He's asking me to have a spine, to stand for something." That was when the mask shattered. Ashley's face contorted, not with sadness, but with pure, unadulterated rage. "Stand for something?" she spat, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "You think this is about honor? You're throwing everything away, this life, our future, me, all because of a stupid outfit and an oversensitive old man who can't take a joke?" The words, so childish and self-serving, hit Liam with the force of a physical blow. This was it. This was the real Ashley, stripped of her elegant veneer. "It's not a joke, Ashley," he said, his own voice quiet, which only seemed to enrage her further. "Oh, this is unbelievable," she shrieked, slamming her wineglass down on the marble side table with enough force to make it crack. "This is my mother's fault. She's the one who had to have a public breakdown and ruin everything. And your father, if he had just played along, if he hadn't been so desperate for attention, none of this would have happened." As she raged, Liam felt a profound and chilling sense of detachment. He was looking at a complete stranger. The woman he loved, the witty, ambitious partner he thought he knew, had been an illusion. The real person was the one standing before him now. A small, panicked, cruel child who saw the world only as a reflection of herself, who saw other people's pain only as an inconvenience to her own ambition. He thought of his father, standing in his workshop, surrounded by things he had built with his own hands, his honor as solid and real as the oak he worked with. Then he looked at Ashley, surrounded by expensive, empty things, her rage a hollow, destructive force. He finally understood. His father's ultimatum wasn't a punishment. It was a gift. It was a lifeline, pulling him from the deep, cold water he hadn't even realized he was drowning in. Ashley was still ranting, her accusations growing more wild. But Liam was no longer listening. The fight was over. The choice had been made. Not by him, but for him, by her. He waited for her to pause, to draw breath in her tirade. When she did, he spoke, his voice completely devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man stating a simple, immutable fact. "The problem, Ashley," he said, looking at her with eyes that felt 100 years old, "is that you still don't understand why it wasn't a costume." He watched the confusion, then the dawning horror register on her face. She knew, in that instant, that she had lost. "Goodbye, Ashley," he said. He turned and walked to the door. He reached into his pocket, took out his keyring, and slid the heavy, designer key to the penthouse off the ring. He placed it on the sterile, white counter by the door. It made a small, final click in the sudden silence. He didn't look back. As he walked down the long, white hallway to the elevator, he could hear the sound of something shattering behind him, a lamp, a vase, a life. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt a grief so deep it was bottomless. He was mourning the loss of a woman who had never really existed, and the future he had built with her, a beautiful, perfect house with no foundation at all. The elevator doors slid shut, and he was finally, blessedly, alone. Over 99% of viewers just sat through this story without clicking like or subscribe. Actually, it's easy, just one tap. What time is it in your area, and where are you listening? Months passed. Autumn bled into a mild California winter. Frank found a new rhythm to his days, a quiet peace that settled in the spaces where the anger and hurt used to be. The rocking chair was finished, its oak grain glowing under layers of hand-rubbed oil. It sat in a corner of his living room, a silent testament to patience and restoration. He hadn't heard from Liam, and he hadn't expected to. The silence was its own kind of answer. One bright Saturday morning, there was a knock on his door. It was Eleanor Vance. She stood on his doorstep, looking smaller and more uncertain than he'd ever seen her, holding a simple bouquet of daisies. "I hope this is okay," she said, her voice soft. "It's okay," Frank said, and stepped aside to let her in. He made her a cup of tea, and they sat in his small, cozy living room. For the first time, Eleanor seemed to truly see his home, the photos of Mary on the mantelpiece, the warm but comfortable furniture, the faint, clean scent of sawdust that clung to everything. It was a space built from love and life, not designed for show. She told him what had happened after Liam left the penthouse. She spoke of Ashley not with anger, but with a profound, aching sadness. The broken engagement had triggered a complete collapse. Ashley had refused to see anyone, blaming everyone but herself. She and Robert had tried to help, but their daughter was a stranger to them, enclosed in the fortress of bitterness. They didn't dwell on Ashley. Instead, for the first time, they talked about that Halloween night 20 years ago. They sat not as a hero and a victim, but as two survivors, sharing the pieces of a story that had defined both their lives. "I always wonder what happened to the woman in that house," Frank said, looking into the middle distance. "If she was okay. I've always wondered how to say thank you to the man who saved my life," Eleanor replied, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you, Frank, for my life, for the years I got to have." In that shared moment, the circle finally closed. They weren't talking about the party, or their children, or the disastrous collision of their two worlds. They were talking about fear and survival, about the scars, visible and invisible, that they both carried. There were two people finding a quiet, unexpected peace in a shared history. Another week passed. Frank was in his workshop, sanding down a new piece of pine, when he heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. He looked up, his heart giving a painful lurch. It was Liam's car. Liam got out. He looked different, thinner, maybe, but the frantic, anxious energy was gone. He was wearing simple jeans and a flannel shirt, and he wasn't carrying any gifts. He just stood there for a moment, looking at his father. I thought maybe you could use a hand," Liam said, gesturing vaguely at the woodshop. Frank didn't say anything. He just looked at his son, at the man who was finally, tentatively, finding his way back to himself. He nodded toward a workbench. "There's a chair over there that needs its joints re-glued. Think you're up for it?" Liam's shoulders relaxed, a small, grateful smile touching his lips. "Yeah, Dad, I think I am." He walked into the workshop, the place he had once seen as a relic of an embarrassing past, and it felt like coming home. The sun streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating the particles of sawdust dancing in the air. Frank handed him a piece of sandpaper. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic pronouncements. There was only the quiet, shared work of rebuilding something that had been broken, one piece at a time. The sound of their sanding, a steady, rhythmic scraping, was the sound of a new beginning, a legacy not of fire and ashes, but of patience, forgiveness, and the enduring strength of wood and bone.